It was a bright and peaceful evening at Maplewood Park, a popular place in the city where families, friends, and joggers often spent their time. The sun was slowly setting, casting a warm glow over the park, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and playful chatter. In the middle of the park, a group of teenagers gathered near the swings, and at the far end, 18-year-old Rachel Johnson sat on a bench, tutoring a couple of younger kids who were struggling with their math homework. Rachel was a bright and ambitious young woman. She had always been determined to help those around her and had earned a reputation for her kindness. Rachel dreamed of becoming a lawyer one day and was already getting involved in community service projects, hoping to make a difference in her city. Today, she was helping the kids with their schoolwork, something she enjoyed doing in her spare time. Nearby, Officer Todd Miller, a young cop who had only recently joined the Maplewood Police Department, was patrolling the area. He was a rookie officer, eager to prove himself to his colleagues and superiors. Officer Miller had always prided himself on being a tough, no-nonsense officer, though his inexperience sometimes led him to misjudge situations. He walked the park, occasionally speaking to parkgoers, trying to assert his authority as part of his new role. As Officer Miller continued his patrol, he noticed a group of teenagers standing by the park benches near Rachel. He didn't recognize them, and they seemed to be talking loudly. His gut feeling told him something was off. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a little uneasy. He had been told that the area had a history of incidents, and his mind quickly jumped to conclusions. Without thinking too much, Officer Miller approached the group of teenagers with authority in his voice. He was about to address them when he spotted Rachel sitting a little farther away with two younger kids, their heads bent over some notebooks. Something about the scene seemed peaceful to him, but he was already on edge. He decided to confront her first. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Officer Miller said, walking up to Rachel. His voice was firm, almost aggressive, as he stared at her. The young officer didn't know who Rachel was or what she was doing. All he saw was a group of young people gathering near the park at the same time as the others, and his suspicion led him to treat them all as potential troublemakers. Rachel was surprised at first by the officer's sudden approach. She stood up, trying to keep her calm. "I'm just helping these kids with their math," she explained, showing the officer the notebooks. She spoke politely but firmly, trying to explain that there was no need for aggression. But Officer Miller wasn't having it. In his mind, any confrontation had to be handled with force. He stepped closer, eyes narrowed as he looked Rachel up and down, scanning her as if she were a threat. Rachel stood her ground, not backing down, but there was an underlying tension in the air. "You can't be sitting here like this," he said, his voice growing louder. "What are you up to, huh?" Rachel felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew what he was implying, and it didn't sit well with her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but she could feel the situation quickly escalating. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm helping these kids with their homework. There's no need to get loud." As the tension grew, other people in the park began to notice the interaction. A few parents looked over curiously, some shaking their heads at the unnecessary confrontation. Rachel didn't want to make a scene, but she felt her patience wearing thin. This was not the first time she had experienced being unfairly judged because of her race, but it was the first time it had happened like this, right in front of people she had grown up with. She took a deep breath and stood tall. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, but before she could say anything else, Officer Miller raised his hand, dismissing her words. His frustration was building, and he was convinced that something wasn't right. As Rachel held her ground, Officer Miller's tone became even more forceful. His demeanor suggested that he wasn't interested in hearing her side of the story. His growing impatience would soon lead to actions that would change Rachel's life forever. In the background, more people were watching, some reaching for their phones to capture what was happening. The tension was thick in the air. What started as a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. The peaceful evening in the park was about to be disrupted in ways no one could have predicted. The situation between Rachel and Officer Miller continued to escalate. The air around them felt tense, and the bystanders who had been casually enjoying their time at the park were now watching, sensing that something was wrong. The children sitting with Rachel were visibly nervous, unsure of what was happening. As Officer Miller grew more frustrated, his voice became louder, more insistent. "What's your problem?" he demanded, stepping closer to Rachel. "You think you can just sit here in the park without any trouble?" Rachel stood her ground, refusing to back down. She had spent her whole life learning to be strong in moments like this, moments when she knew that the system might not always see her as equal, but she also knew that staying calm was her best chance at diffusing the situation. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said calmly. "I'm just helping these kids with their homework. There's no need for this to be a bigger deal than it is." The officer didn't seem to hear her. He was too focused on his own assumptions, too caught up in the idea that something was off. His eyes narrowed, scanning Rachel as if he were searching for a reason to justify his actions. The air was thick with tension. "You're not supposed to be here like this," Officer Miller barked, ignoring her explanation. "Move along." His tone was demanding, and the authoritative edge in his voice suggested that he wasn't willing to listen to reason. Rachel could feel her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not breaking any rules," she repeated, trying to reason with him. "I'm just sitting here, helping these kids. You don't have to treat me like I'm doing something wrong." But Officer Miller was not having it. His patience was thinning, and his frustration was mounting. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, taking a step forward. Rachel instinctively took a step back. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but she knew the officer's behavior was only becoming more aggressive. Just as Rachel was about to say something more, Officer Miller reached for his pepper spray. He wasn't thinking about the consequences or what he had been told to do. He was thinking about power, about asserting control over the situation, regardless of the truth. Rachel's eyes widened in shock as she saw him raise the canister toward her. She stepped back, her hands instinctively coming up to shield her face. But it was too late. Officer Miller pressed the button, sending a stream of pepper spray toward Rachel. She gasped, the burning sensation immediately filling her eyes and throat. The world blurred around her as her skin felt like it was on fire. Her hand flew to her face, trying to wipe away the burning liquid, but it was no use. The pain was sharp and intense. The children she had been tutoring scrambled to their feet, frightened and confused. Rachel's vision became blurry, and her throat burned as she gasped for air. Officer Miller stood over her, looking down at her with a sense of pride in his actions. He had taken control, he thought. He had shown her who was in charge. But he didn't see the bigger picture. He didn't know that Rachel was not just any person sitting in the park. The children, still terrified, looked around in confusion. A few bystanders stepped closer, unsure of what to do, but feeling that the situation was wrong. People had begun filming, their phones raised, capturing the moment that would soon be shared across the city and beyond. The tension in the air was palpable. Rachel tried to fight back the tears as the pepper spray burned her eyes, but she couldn't stop herself from coughing. Her head spun, and she felt like she was going to collapse. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was someone who had made a snap judgment based on her appearance, someone who thought he could push her around without facing any consequences. Meanwhile, in the distance, a man in a sharp suit was walking toward the scene, his face filled with determination. He was Rachel's father, and he had been watching from a distance. The moment he saw his daughter in distress, he immediately recognized the danger she was in. He quickened his pace, knowing that he needed to intervene. He had built his career on making sure that people like his daughter were treated with fairness and respect. He was the mayor of the city, and he knew that he could change the course of the situation, but only if he got there in time. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the officer standing over his daughter, not realizing that his actions were about to have far-reaching consequences. The police officer had no idea who he was messing with. He had no idea who Rachel's father was. But Rachel's father did know what was happening. He had seen it all unfold from a distance. He had seen how his daughter was treated, and now he was ready to act. The scene was about to take a dramatic turn, and the officer had no idea what was coming. Rachel's heart was still pounding as she struggled to breathe through the burning sensation in her eyes. The world felt like it was spinning, and she was unable to stop coughing, her throat raw from the sting of the pepper spray. She wanted to get up, to fight back, but the pain was too overwhelming. Her vision was blurry, and the world around her seemed to fade into darkness. Officer Miller stood over her, a satisfied look on his face. He believed he had done his job, that he had taught this woman a lesson. He didn't know that the story he thought he was controlling was far bigger than his narrow view of the situation. Rachel's father, Mayor Williams, was almost at the scene now. His eyes were locked on the officer, his fists clenched at his sides. As a public servant and the head of the city, he had worked tirelessly for years to ensure fairness and equality for all his citizens. His passion for justice was unwavering, and seeing his daughter treated like this filled him with both fury and determination. He was the kind of person who always stood up for others, no matter the cost. As Mayor Williams approached, the officer seemed unaware of the powerful man heading toward him. Rachel was still on the ground, her hands gripping the pavement for support, her face contorted in pain. She could barely keep her eyes open, and the harsh air felt like needles against her skin. The bystanders were starting to murmur, exchanging confused glances as they realized what had happened. A few had already started recording, their phones capturing the injustice unfolding before them. Mayor Williams was now just steps away from the officer. His voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "What are you doing to my daughter?" he demanded, his tone sharp and unwavering. The officer froze, his eyes wide with surprise. He had not expected this. He hadn't known who Rachel was, or who her father was. The officer looked up, still holding the canister of pepper spray in his hand, his confusion evident on his face. He wasn't sure what was happening, or why the man seemed so angry. But as his eyes locked with Mayor Williams, and he recognized the serious expression on his face, the realization began to sink in. I didn't know," the officer stammered, his voice faltering. "Of course you didn't," Mayor Williams said coldly. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Rachel and the officer. His presence was commanding, and his reputation in the city was well known. He had fought for equality, for better treatment of every citizen, regardless of their race, gender, or background. He was a man who had power, but he had always used it for good. The officer, now realizing the gravity of the situation, took a step back. Rachel was still on the ground, her hands trembling as she tried to wipe the sting from her eyes. She could hear her father's voice, and felt a small sense of relief. She had been through so much already, but knowing that her father was here, that he was standing up for her, gave her a glimmer of hope. "Help her," the mayor said to the bystanders, his voice strong. "She needs medical attention right now. And you, officer, you've made a huge mistake." As Mayor Williams took control of the situation, the officer seemed to realize the enormity of his actions. His hand dropped from Rachel's arm, and he stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The world around him seemed to slow down as the realization set in. He had no idea who Rachel was, but now he knew the consequences of his mistake. The bystanders, who had been hesitant at first, were now speaking up. Some of them stepped forward, offering rational assistance, while others were still recording, their phones capturing everything. Rachel's breathing was still shallow, but she could hear her father's voice, steady and firm, in the background. The pain was overwhelming, but there was a sense of comfort in knowing that her father would take care of everything. He was not only her father, but he was also a figure of authority, someone who had the power to make sure this injustice was addressed. "You're going to be fine," Mayor Williams told his daughter as he knelt down beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. We're going to make sure this is handled the right way." As the officer stood back, his mind racing with the realization of who he had just assaulted, Mayor Williams turned to face him. "You're not going anywhere. We'll be talking about this," he said, his voice filled with authority. "I won't let this go." The officer swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. His confidence had faltered, and he was now acutely aware of the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding anymore. This was about power, responsibility, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, no matter who they were. As the sirens grew louder, the first responders arrived on the scene. They immediately rushed to Rachel, who was still sitting on the ground, her face bruised and her eyes red from the pepper spray. Mayor Williams knelt beside her, gently lifting her head to look her in the eye. "Stay with me, Rachel," he said softly. His voice was calm, but the worry was evident in his eyes. He could see the pain in her face, but he was also determined not to let the situation escalate any further. He knew that he had to handle this with care, not only for his daughter, but for the people watching. Rachel winced as one of the medical team members sprayed a cooling solution onto her face. The sting was intense, but the relief of having the burning sensation start to fade was comforting. She tried to smile, but the pain and shock were still overwhelming. "I'm okay, Dad," she whispered, but it was clear she was shaken by what had happened. The officer who had attacked her stood a few feet away, his body tense and uncertain. He had realized by now that Rachel was not just any woman on the street. She wasn't just a random person he could intimidate or control. She was the daughter of the city's most powerful figure, and now the consequences of his actions were unfolding before him. Mayor Williams stood up slowly, turning to face the officer. His posture was unwavering, and his face showed no sign of mercy. "You've made a serious mistake," he said calmly but with a stern tone. "You don't just go around hurting people, especially not like this. I'm going to make sure this is addressed, and you'll be held accountable." The officer shifted nervously, his hand shaking slightly as he took a step back. The realization of what he had done was sinking in. He had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. His eyes darted between Mayor Williams and the medical team working to help Rachel. He wanted to apologize, but he knew that words couldn't undo the damage he had caused. "Sir, I didn't know," the officer stammered. His voice was weak, and it was clear he regretted his actions, but it was too late for apologies now. Rachel's father was not a man who could be easily appeased with empty words. "You should have known," Mayor Williams replied coldly. "It doesn't matter who someone is or how they look. You have no right to treat people like this, especially not my daughter." The scene was tense. Bystanders were still watching, some filming on their phones, others speaking in hushed tones. There was a sense of disbelief among them, as they tried to process the situation. They had seen what had happened, a police officer using excessive force against an innocent woman. But the truth was, they didn't know the full story yet. The officers who had arrived with the first responders began to move in, observing the situation carefully. One of them, who had witnessed the incident, stepped forward. "Mayor, we're here to help," he said. "We'll make sure she gets the care she needs." Rachel was being helped into an ambulance, the medical team continuing to tend to her injuries. As she was lifted into the vehicle, her eyes met her father's once again. The look they shared said everything. Despite the pain, despite the shock, she knew her father would make sure justice was served. Mayor Williams stayed by her side until the ambulance doors closed. He wasn't going to let this slide. As the vehicle sped off toward the hospital, he stood still, his mind already racing. This wasn't just a personal matter. It was about the broader issue of how people in positions of power treated others. How many other people had been hurt by officers like the one who had attacked Rachel? How many had suffered in silence, with no one to speak up for them? Rachel's case wasn't just about her. It was a symbol of the injustice that so many people faced every day. People who were treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or background. Her father was a man of principles, and he was determined to use his position to bring about change. He wasn't just going to fight for his daughter. He was going to fight for everyone who had ever been wronged. As the sun began to set, the tension in the air was palpable. There were still so many questions that needed answers, but one thing was clear. This incident was going to spark a much-needed conversation about justice and accountability. The officer who had harmed Rachel was not just any cop. He was a representation of a larger system that needed to change. And Mayor Williams was ready to take on that fight, no matter what it took. With a final glance at the direction the ambulance had gone, he turned back to the officer. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and firm. "And I will make sure you are held accountable for what you've done." The next morning, the news about the incident spread like wildfire. The media was buzzing with stories of the brutal confrontation between a police officer and Rachel Williams. Everyone was talking about it. From the news outlets to the people on social media, people were furious, questioning why an officer would ever use such force against an innocent woman, especially someone as prominent as Rachel's father. Rachel's father, Mayor Williams, had already made a public statement calling for justice. He had declared that an investigation would be launched immediately, and that the officer who had attacked his daughter would face the consequences of his actions. But as the day passed, the pressure on him grew. The public was waiting to see what he would do next. The media was relentless, demanding answers. Rachel, on the other hand, was still recovering in the hospital. Her physical injuries were healing, but the emotional wounds were much deeper. She had never imagined she would be treated this way, especially not in a city where her father held such power. But now she was left wondering how many others had gone through the same thing and had no one to fight for them. As she lay in her hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and cards from well-wishers, Rachel couldn't help but feel conflicted. Part of her wanted to stay quiet, to let the whole thing blow over. After all, she had her father's support, and he would handle everything. But another part of her knew that this wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger. She was aware of the power her father had, but she had also seen how easily people could be silenced. The same system that had failed so many others had allowed people like the officer to act with impunity. She knew that if she didn't stand up, nothing would change. She couldn't let this moment pass without making a difference. Rachel knew her father well enough to know that he would not back down, but she also knew that he would never fight alone. He had always been a man of principle, and he had always taught her to fight for what's right, no matter the odds. Now, it was her turn to take a stand. Meanwhile, the officer who had attacked Rachel was in hiding. He had been placed on administrative leave, but his future within the department was uncertain. He had not spoken publicly about the incident, and the department was conducting its own internal investigation. But the public outcry was growing louder by the hour. The pressure was mounting on the police force to take action, and the officer knew that he would soon be facing serious consequences for what he had done. The officer had not expected this kind of attention. He had assumed that the situation would be easily swept under the rug. But Rachel's father was a powerful figure, and people were rallying behind her. The officer found himself in a difficult position, one that he could not escape from. The city was demanding answers, and justice seemed inevitable. In the coming days, more information would surface. The media uncovered details about the officer's previous conduct, including complaints of excessive force and misconduct. The department's history of ignoring such complaints was also brought to light, showing a pattern of neglect and cover-ups. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger problem within the police force. Rachel, though still recovering, was becoming a symbol of resistance. Her father's position gave her a platform to speak out, and she was determined to use it. Her story was spreading across the country, inspiring people to stand up for justice and demand accountability from those in power. In an emotional interview, Rachel spoke about her experience, expressing her disbelief and frustration. "I never thought something like this would happen to me," she said. "But I can't stay silent. "I won't let this happen to anyone else." Her words resonated with many, and her courage became a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. As the investigation continued, Mayor Williams remained steadfast in his commitment to seeking justice for his daughter and for others who had been wronged. He knew that this fight would not be easy, but he also knew that it was necessary. He couldn't let this incident define his city or his legacy. He had always fought for equality and fairness, and now, more than ever, he was ready to lead the charge for change. The fight for justice had just begun. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Rachel and her father were prepared to face it together. And with the support of the public behind them, they were determined to ensure that the officer would be held accountable, and that this would not be the last time someone spoke out against police brutality. The battle for justice was far from over, but with each step, they were one step closer to making a difference. The next morning, the news about the incident spread like wildfire. The media was buzzing with stories of the brutal confrontation between a police officer and Rachel Williams. Everyone was talking about it, from the news outlets to the people on social media. People were furious, questioning why an officer would ever use such force against an innocent woman, especially someone as prominent as Rachel's father. Rachel's father, Mayor Williams, had already made a public statement, calling for justice. He had declared that an investigation would be launched immediately, and that the officer who had attacked his daughter would face the consequences of his actions. But as the day passed, the pressure on him grew. The public was waiting to see what he would do next. The media was relentless, demanding answers. Rachel, on the other hand, was still recovering in the hospital. Her physical injuries were healing, but the emotional wounds were much deeper. She had never imagined she would be treated this way, especially not in a city where her father held such power. But now she was left wondering how many others had gone through the same thing and had no one to fight for them. As she lay in her hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and cards from well-wishers, Rachel couldn't help but feel conflicted. Part of her wanted to stay quiet, to let the whole thing blow over. After all, she had her father's support, and he would handle everything. But another part of her knew that this wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger. She was aware of the power her father had, but she had also seen how easily people could be silenced. The same system that had failed so many others had allowed people like the officer to act with impunity. She knew that if she didn't stand up, nothing would change. She couldn't let this moment pass without making a difference. Rachel knew her father well enough to know that he would not back down, but she also knew that he would never fight alone. He had always been a man of principle, and he had always taught her to fight for what's right, no matter the odds. Now, it was her turn to take a stand. Meanwhile, the officer who had attacked Rachel was in hiding. He had been placed on administrative leave, but his future within the department was uncertain. He had not spoken publicly about the incident, and the department was conducting its own internal investigation. But the public outcry was growing louder by the hour. The pressure was mounting on the police force to take action, and the officer knew that he would soon be facing serious consequences for what he had done. The officer had not expected this kind of attention. He had assumed that the situation would be easily swept under the rug. But Rachel's father was a powerful figure, and people were rallying behind her. The officer found himself in a difficult position, one that he could not escape from. The city was demanding answers, and justice seemed inevitable. In the coming days, more information would surface. The media uncovered details about the officer's previous conduct, including complaints of excessive force and misconduct. The department's history of ignoring such complaints was also brought to light, showing a pattern of neglect and cover-ups. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger problem within the police force. Rachel, though still recovering, was becoming a symbol of resistance. Her father's position gave her a platform to speak out, and she was determined to use it. Her story was spreading across the country, inspiring people to stand up for justice and demand accountability from those in power. In an emotional interview, Rachel spoke about her experience, expressing her disbelief and frustration. "I never thought something like this would happen to me," she said. "But I can't stay silent. I won't let this happen to anyone else." Her words resonated with many, and her courage became a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. As the investigation continued, Mayor Williams remained steadfast in his commitment to seeking justice for his daughter and for others who had been wronged. He knew that this fight would not be easy, but he also knew that it was necessary. He couldn't let this incident define his city or his legacy. He had always fought for equality and fairness, and now, more than ever, he was ready to lead the charge for change. The fight for justice had just begun. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Rachel and her father were prepared to face it together. And with the support of the public behind them, they were determined to ensure that the officer would be held accountable, and that this would not be the last time someone spoke out against police brutality. The battle for justice was far from over, but with each step, they were one step closer to making a difference. Rachel was still recovering physically, but emotionally she had become a strong, unshakable force. With every step forward, she could feel the weight of the movement she was now leading. She never expected to be at the forefront of such a monumental cause, but with the support of her community and her father, she pushed forward. The people had spoken, and it was time for action. Behind the scenes, Mayor Williams worked tirelessly. He knew that, with his position of authority, he had the ability to bring real change. He worked with local organizations, activists, and lawmakers to push for immediate reforms in the police department. His office was flooded with messages of support, as well as heated calls for accountability. Despite the challenges, he remained focused, understanding that the moment had arrived to change the course of the city's history. One of the most significant moves Mayor Williams made was calling for an independent review of the police department's practices. He knew that only through an impartial investigation could the true extent of the department's failure be revealed. This decision was met with some resistance, but the mayor stood firm, promising to fight for justice no matter the cost. Rachel continued to speak to the public, sharing her experiences and demanding transparency. Her voice was loud and powerful, and with each interview, she gained more allies. The support for her cause grew not just in their city, but across the nation. Social media was flooded with messages of solidarity from people who had experienced similar injustices and from those who simply wanted to see change. In the meantime, Officer Harper remained on administrative leave, his fate hanging in the balance. As the investigation progressed, more details about his past were uncovered. It became clear that his behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of misconduct that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The public demanded accountability, and the pressure on the police department to take action grew every day. As public support for Rachel's cause continued to swell, the mayor found himself facing mounting political pressure. Some of his colleagues in the local government were not entirely on board with the changes he was pushing for. They argued that reforming the police would disrupt the system and put the community at risk. But Mayor Williams knew this was not a time to back down. The lives of countless individuals depended on the changes he was fighting for, and he was committed to seeing this through. A local activist, known for their work in advocating for marginalized communities, stood up and addressed the crowd. "We can't keep pretending that nothing needs to change," they said. "The city deserves better. The people deserve better. And it's time we hold those in power accountable." The room fell silent, and for the first time, it seemed that everyone in the room was united. It wasn't just about one officer's actions anymore. It was about the future of their community. The mayor seized the moment and made a powerful statement. "We are going to make things right," he declared. "No one is above the law. I will do whatever it takes to bring justice to the people and ensure that this never happens again. We are stronger together, and we will fight for a safer, fairer future." His words were met with a wave of applause as the crowd, united in their desire for change, cheered. It was a defining moment. Rachel knew that, While the journey ahead would be long and difficult, this was the turning point. The movement had gained momentum, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed, the investigation into the police department deepened. Reforms were put in place, focusing on greater accountability, transparency, and training. The mayor's office worked closely with community leaders to ensure that the people's voices were heard and the necessary changes were implemented. As for Rachel, she found herself at the center of a movement that was much bigger than herself. She was no longer just a victim of a violent incident. She was a leader, a symbol of resilience, and a catalyst for change. Her father remained by her side, proud of the courage she had shown. The fight was far from over, but Rachel knew that she had ignited something that could change the future for generations to come. Together, with her father's leadership and the support of a united community, they would keep pushing forward, knowing that justice and equality were worth every step of the fight. The world had taken notice, and the time for change had arrived.